Oval, London. In 1930, here at his county home ground, Jack Hobbs played his last Test innings after 25 years in first-class cricket. Shortly afterwards, a new main entrance was built for the ground. The centrepiece was the Hobbs Gates.
At the end of Hobbs's career, the Surrey committee decided to make this gesture to name their new gates at the Oval after their greatest cricketer. And I think the fact that they named it after a professional cricketer, it's a real, almost in one statement, it just sums up just the influence and the status of Hobbs as a great cricketer. And I think today, for any, in this modern age of one-day cricket and colour and glitz, the fact that on one side of London you've got the Grace Gates and on the other side the Hobbs Gates, there's a real nice balance there.
The Hobbs Gates are a suitable partner for the Grace Gates across London at Lord's, and especially fitting for the man who bridged the gap between Grace and Bradman as cricket's greatest player.
He was unarguably the greatest cricketer after W.G. Grace and before Bradman. I mean, there's no one else to fill any of those boots on either side, really.
Jack Hobbs was still going at his best when Bradman first began, and Jack Hobbs, England still regards him as the best player that ever they have seen. They'll still argue it out, much to their difficulty in saying that he was even a greater player than Bradman.
Despite his status as a hero, Hobbs wasn't a larrikin or a stylist or a murderer of the ball. His batting was sure and unhurried.
He's a great technician. He's said to be, by Bradman, the first to produce a technique that could be copied by everyone else. A simple technique, playing straight all the time, keeping everything in the arc between mid-off and mid-on. Very good defence, and Australian players who played against him, but when I was coming up in Sheffield Shield cricket in Australia many years ago, Australian players who played against him said Jack Hobbs is the best English player there's ever been.
He was very correct. He was also a brilliant cover fieldsman, would have held his own in modern one-day cricket. But his strokes were correct, never took liberties, very thoughtful batsman, marvellous to bat with, which is also something that not all the greats can claim.
Jack Hobbs was the master. That was his nickname, and it really befitted him. He was a colossus.
In my view, I doubt that any cricketer in history could have understood the game or the art of batting better than Jack Hobbs. He was, to me, the pro's pro in the sense that he would have understood. His approach to batting was, as I read it, was always to do whatever was best for each delivery. And I think that he is one of those cricketers could have sat down at the end of his career and thought, I got absolutely everything out of the game that I could have.
Technically as good a player as there's ever been, and post-war people say that about Len Hutton. Hobbs was in that class. Everybody I've spoken to said that never at any time during his career, he was never ever fell foul of officialdom, of umpires, the opposition. You never heard a bad word. As a gentleman and a gentleman, he was number one.
Joe Berry Hobbs was born in Cambridge in 1882, the oldest of 12 children. His family's circumstances were poor and from time to time desperate. It has been said that nothing came easy to him, except batting. Hobbs' father was a net bowler and later a groundsman at Jesus College, Cambridge. Young Jack learned cricket simply by observing and listening. Influential in Hobbs' early career was Tom Hayward of Surrey.
Tom Hayward was a great Surrey batsman, the second man after Grace to score 100 first-class centuries. And he spotted Hobbs and recognised that Hobbs potentially was a great player and brought him to Surrey, and then once there encouraged him and had the nous and the perception to take Hobbs in first with him on Hobbs's debut. I mean, Hobbs then became one of the great opening batsmen. There must have been a temptation with the young up-and-comer to put him down the order, but no, Haywood took him in first with him.
Tom was, I suppose, to be regarded as his first main opening partner for Surrey. He went on to open the batting for Surrey with Andy Sandham, another legend of the game. But Haywood and Hobbs were the first main opening partnership, if you like, in his career, and he also went on to open the batting very successfully for England with Herbert Sutcliffe. But Tom Haywood certainly, Hobbs at the other end from him, had the opportunity to study his technique, and they obviously spent a great deal of time together in the middle, and there's no question it had a very profound effect on Jack Hobbs throughout his career.
His Test debut came in Australia in early 1908, but it wasn't until South Africa in 1909 that Hobbs established himself as a Test batsman. He made 3 50s, then 187 in the last Test. In this innings, he found a way to counter a unique South African attack.
South Africa at the time had an attack dominated by leg spinners and wrong-on bowlers, or googly bowlers as they were called, or Bosies, named after Bosanquet, who invented the ball. And Hobbs mastered them. He was the one player who, on those wickets, some of which were Manning wickets, he had a wonderful series and was clearly, by a long, long way, the best batsman in the side. I mean, Haywood, who was in the side, struggled against the googly spinners, but Hobbs was preeminent.
It's interesting that despite the fact that Jack Hobbs has this remarkable record, he didn't actually score his first Test century until his 12th match, and that was towards the end of the tour against South Africa. And that tour was marked by the fact that South Africa had 4 googly bowlers. And Hobbs came to terms with those googly bowlers and really established himself on that tour of South Africa as a Test-class batsman.
If Hobbs had convinced England and South Africa of his greatness, the Australians were not yet convinced. He set the record straight in 1911-1912. He made 3 Test centuries and finished with 662 runs for the series.
I believe that Jack Hobbs could still have thrived in the modern game, and I think there are several cricketers, you look at the black and white footage of them playing and you just wonder, would they have actually been as good in the modern era when, you know, the game is a harsher, faster, nastier game in many ways.
Rhodes was the man who Hobbs partnered for England prior to the famous partnership with Herbert Sutcliffe. And they put on a remarkable stand in one Test match of 323.
By 1914, Hobbs was, by consensus, the best batsman in the world, and perhaps the most professional and unassuming.
Through the first decade of the 20th century, certainly Australians would have said that Trumper was the best player in the world. But even Australians, after Hobbs's performance in Australia in 1911-12, would have to have conceded that Hobbs was now the best player in the world. And his performances in the next 2 or 3 years, certainly he had a wonderful season in England in 1914. Hobbs was, when the world went to war in 1914, there is no doubt that Hobbs was the best batsman in the game.
He had an extra gear. He could have gone on and been even better than he needed to be, which was already among the greatest of all.
Jack Hobbs returned to top-level cricket after the war in 1919. He was 36. If he was a less brilliant batsman, he was undoubtedly a more prolific one. He went on to score another 35,017 runs, including 131 centuries.
The Hobbs after World War I was a different player than before the war. He wasn't quite as much of a free spirit, if you like. He was more your technician, more a gatherer of ones and twos. Again, I can only stress that to me, the way he changed his batting style after the war just showed how much he understood the art of batting. He became super reliable, scored an astonishing number of centuries after his 40th birthday. And but without ever, certainly the Australian, you read reviews in Australian, the Australian press of Hobbs on his post-war tours, And they talk about him being Trumper-esque before the war in the way he played, but there was certainly none of that after the war. He was much more of an astute professional, gathering his runs.
Those who watched Hobbs in the 20s were told that there's only been one greater batsman, and that was the pre-war Jack Hobbs, between 1905 and when the war broke out in 14. He was a gentleman. This fellow was practically without blemish and almost without anecdote. He was kind, considerate, modest, but of course he had great will and determination.
Even though he was an amateur, he was one of the first people really to bridge that amateur-professional divide. And he used to get himself out after getting to 100, which obviously no one would do in this day and age.
Hobbs played 2 of his most celebrated Test match innings on wickets that favoured bowlers, at the Oval in 1926 and at the MCG in 1929. On both occasions, his partner was Herbert Sutcliffe.
The quintessential opening partnership for England, Jack Hobbs and Herbert Sutcliffe, the 2 professional players, and an interesting contrast really, because you had Sutcliffe, the Yorkshireman, the doughty professional, and on the other hand you had Jack Hobbs, the slightly more laid-back, laconic southerner, but they gelled so really well at the top of the order for England.
Hobbs and Sutcliffe are the opening pair by which all other pairs are judged, really. Their record, especially when things were difficult and when difficult things had to be done, is as good as any opening partnership, opening pair ever.
Hobbs and Sutcliffe are part of the language now, a Yorkshireman and a Surrey man who didn't need to call. They trusted each other, the ball would leave the bat and off they'd go. It was almost like a sixth sense.
In the 5th Test of the 1926 series at the Oval, the fate of the Ashes depended on Hobbs and Sutcliffe.
A remarkable partnership because of the pressure that the 2 players were under. Hobbs and Sutcliffe added 172 at the Oval. That's the bald facts. But behind that fact is that this was the Test match which ultimately would decide the destination of the Ashes. It was 0-0. The first 4 Test matches had been drawn. It was quite a wet summer, and during the course of that last Test match, there was rain. The pitch was rain affected. In those days, the pitches weren't covered, so it required all the skill of those 2 players who were experts on bad wickets to put on 172 for that first wicket and really set the seal on the England innings, the England second innings as it was, and they were able to post a very significant total, which Australia wasn't able to match.
Defending the Ashes in 1928-29, England had taken a 2-0 series lead, but were trapped on a typically dangerous Melbourne wet wicket. Hobbs and Sutcliffe shared a partnership that was acclaimed as the greatest in the history of Test cricket.
Hugh Trumbull, who was a great Australian bowler around the turn of the century, who was then the secretary of the Melbourne Cricket Club, he actually went into the Melbourne dressing room and said, "I'm really sorry about the wet wicket, you'll struggle to get 100. And you can imagine what Hobbs and Sutcliffe would have thought about that when they then went out, and batted for most of the day. By all accounts, it was going to be a diabolical wicket. The ball just kicking up at the head, and there are stories of both Hobbs and Sutcliffe being hit. Bert Oldfield had conceded 2 byes in the series to that point, and then while England had been scoring the other side of 1,000 runs, but in that one afternoon, he conceded 17 byes. Conditions were diabolical, but they weren't too diabolical for Hobbs and Sutcliffe.
In 1930, Hobbs broke W.G. Grace's record aggregate for first-class runs. He also played his final Test match that year in a series dominated by the young Don Bradman.
He went on and on and on, and if age didn't have to wear him, he'd still be going now. It was he was just the master.
Hobbs retired from all first-class cricket in 1934. His last innings yielded 38, 13 less than his age.
Well, I think he was, they call him the master, and he was the master of technique. And he played on uncovered pitches. He was a master against spin. He loved the game, basically, and I think that helped to keep him going on into his 50s, because he has great enthusiasm for the game.
In 1953, Hobbs was knighted, the first English professional sportsman to win a knighthood purely for services to his sport.
Hobbs was knighted in 1953, and he was the first English cricketer to be knighted purely for his contribution to the game on the field. Bradman had been knighted 4 years earlier, and there'd been a number of English cricketers who were amateurs, officials as much as players, who had received knighthoods, but Hobbs got his knighthood because he was a great cricketer. And the significance of that shouldn't be underrated. I mean, it really shows his standing in the game. It also shows how much he was a champion of all classes of people, from his own, very much working class background, right through to the toffs in the long room at Lord's and the Oval. He was respected across the board, and his knighthood reflected that.
He was one of the longest serving professional cricketers, played from just the start of the 20th century right to the early 30s, disapproved of bodyline, thought it was immoral and unsportsmanlike, and that spoke for him. And in due course, he became the first professional to be knighted. And it was a huge honour for him, but he recognised that it was to the profession of cricket, to those who earn their living from the game, and he was a model, an absolutely model man, and it was a very fine appointment, one of the best knighthoods of them all.
Sir Jack Hobbs died in 1963, remembered as the people's champion, and perhaps the finest batsman England has produced.
Sometimes statistics can lie, but I don't think they do in this case. I think it gives a really accurate reflection of the guy. The batsman. He was a batsman who was just that little bit better at doing all the fundamental things right than everyone else. And he's the sort of bloke you'd expect to be at the top of those sort of lists.
He scored 199, used to be 197, got bumped up to 199 first-class hundreds, which is just phenomenal. 100 of those came after the age of 40.
But that's an awful lot of hundreds to get, that you sort of always get 100 hundreds after you're 40. So, that's what I always think about when somebody asks me about Jack Hobbs, and I just wonder how he managed to do it. It must have been a different way of life, a different sort of era. But he was just phenomenal. It
wasn't just his batting that made him a great cricketer. He was one of the first revolutionary cricketers in terms of fielding. He really did make it an art. He could also bowl a little bit. He didn't bowl a great deal in Test cricket. I think he got 1 wicket.
All sport has its history, its starting point. And when I was a kid, Sir Jack Hobbs was the one name that kept on hitting me from the past. And when you look at what he did, he must have been a fine player. Of that, there's no doubt. And I would never know how good, but I don't want to know how good. To me, he was a legend then, and must have been one of the all-time great players.
He was pragmatic, principled, calm and adaptable. He was a great player on good wickets and bad. Had he been playing today, he would have been a champion and a crowd favourite. For talent, for style, for modesty, and for decency, Jack Hobbs has earned a place in the top 5 of ESPN's Legends of Cricket.